Welcome to Beholder Beauty podcasts, where we talk about beauty, faith, and some of the difficult things in life so that you know that you're not alone. And then together we stir up God's kingdom. And my guest today on Beholder Beauty is Lori Ann Wood. And she's the author of Divine Detour, The Path You'd Never Choose Can Lead to the Faith You've Always Wanted. And so welcome, Lori Ann.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. It's so great to be here.
It's so nice to have you here. What part of the country are you in?
I am in Northwest Arkansas.
So let's start the podcast off by you telling us about yourself.
Yes. So I am an empty nest mom. I have 3 grown children, and I have a 3-year-old granddaughter and a grandson. And I am really an unlikely writer. You mentioned the book. The book came out in 2023, and it was really on the heels of a sudden diagnosis of end-stage heart failure that I got 10 years ago. So I'm a writer and speaker in the Christian nonfiction space, and I just do a lot of freelance writing, but also blogging, speaking, and then talking about my book.
Well, for being an unlikely writer, I have read your book, and you write really well.
Oh, thank you.
Beautiful writing. I love how you brought your journals from the time that you had first went through the heart failure right into the story. And so we're going to talk about that more down the line, everybody. But first, we're going to do our beauty questions just to have a little bit of fun. And so what is your favorite lipstick color or beauty tip and/or?
Okay. So my question is chapstick a color? Because but really in the last few years, I've started using the Burt's Bees tinted lip balm, and that's really my go-to because I'm not especially a makeup person. But another thing I've learned late in life is one of my daughters bought me for a birthday a couple years ago a facial, and I had never had a facial before. And I loved it, not so much for the facial itself, although that was great, but I loved that they gave me advice on what products to use for my age and my skin type. And that was all new information to me because I grew up in the Noxzema era, where if your sister didn't use it all, then you used Noxzema, and if she did use it all, then you just used soap and water, and that was good enough. So this was all new advice to me, and I loved, and I didn't necessarily buy the products from the place where I got the facial, but I learned what I needed to find, and then just being consistent with that routine and drinking lots of water and getting lots of sleep go a really long way in, I think, beauty.
Yes, I agree with you. It's like our lifestyle does really make a difference on how we look or how we're going to age and all of that. And then it's the other flip side is then taking care of the skin, like what are its needs? Are we cleaning it? Are we moisturizing it? Are we protecting it? Are we, and if we do have any inflammation or that sort of thing on top, often it's coming from inside, and sometimes it can be emotional too, but often it is, and it can be hormones, but often it's diet or lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
So yeah, it does go a lot. And yes, Burt's Bee does qualify as a and it's actually because for the past 30 years, and I've sort of retired out of that, but my day job was as a makeup artist on film and television, and one of our go-tos for many of our leading ladies who they want to look like you look right now. They want a natural, pretty beauty makeup where you're just like, okay, she looks radiant. She's just naturally that way. We didn't do anything to her, and or much tour, right? And so Burt's Bees with the one lipstick or chapstick lipstick, lip balm, that really gives you that effect film.
Mhm.
It makes a woman look a little fresher, a little happier, a little, just a little extra than no lipstick or, just a
Yeah.
clear one. So, and it lasts long and it's like,
Yeah.
but it doesn't look too much.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you validated my choice. Thank you.
I know. It's kind of like, and there's so many good colors.
Uh-huh.
So then the next part of this is, so we've talked about kind of the fun part, but then also, have you ever struggled with your beauty?
Mhm. Yes, I think almost every woman has, and it there's so much about your upbringing and your own thoughts and your own personal self-confidence and your understanding of what beauty is, I think all play into that, and we have these ideas of what we want ourselves to look like, but there's also just the idea of who we are and that letting that shine through.
That's so nice. Do you have daughters or sons?
I have 2 daughters and 1 son.
Okay. And so, in a sense, if you want to bring them into this part of it, if not, as a mother, like d when they, of course, as we all struggle with this, especially when they're starting to become a woman and even realizing it, like all of a sudden there's that day where, like, like one of my friends said, "Oh, my daughter's now wearing, eyebrows."
Yeah, that's the face.
And I think that's a beautiful, like when the girl does her eyebrows and then nothing, else sort
Yeah.
of thing, kind of, because I think naturally we will pick a feature that we want to enhance or that sort of
Mhm,
thing. And then it's more artistic in a sense rather than
mhm.
it's an expressing ourselves, I think. Did they struggle, and how did you help maybe let them? Did it help them to bring in how God sees them as His
Mm.
beautiful daughter? And then also, did it help you?
Yes. I do think it helped them because that was always something that was, that was surrounding them from their birth, and they knew that value. And I think that underlies even though there's always gonna be a little bit of insecurity or struggle there, there's always that bedrock underneath that says, "But wait a minute, I know this to be true about myself." And I think they had that, and they're both very well adjusted in that area, and in fact, they are the ones that give me advice on most things, which maybe that's true of all moms who have adult daughters, but they're a great example to me.
And then did you have that same thing surrounding you growing up? And if you didn't, did it make it harder for you?
I one of the things I lost my mom in 2020, and we went through a lot of pictures after she passed away. And one of the things that struck me was that I don't think I realized how beautiful my mother was when I was growing up. And we found old pictures, and I would say she was just stunning. And I'm like, I don't remember ever thinking, wow, what a beauty my mother is. And yet she was. In my heart, she was, of course, but I think I didn't see her outward beauty as much because she was my mom. But she certainly, was always an encouragement and always validated us, and our confidence was always there, and it just wasn't I grew up on a farm, and, it wasn't something that was talked about very much or put at the forefront of any priority list or anything like that, but I always knew that I had her and dad's support and utmost confidence in me.
Yeah, because I think, because I trying to remember that age, and I think without maybe sometimes the conversation with some people, especially if they don't know their bedrock, right, and God and the value of who they are, or they're just unsure or that sort of thing, you know, didn't you like I remember in my days, 'cause I kind of grew up in the 70s. And at that time, it was magazines, and then I
Mhm.
would look at 17 magazine and be like, I don't look like them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then I'd look at, say, some of the girls in school or like more like the popular one and like I don't look like them. So,
Yeah.
and then the problem with some of that is then you try to change yourself to look like them. Now, if it's a person in real life, but if it's somebody in a magazine or somebody on a screen nowadays, we have to realize that that's been altered.
Right.
They don't look like that either,
Right.
but your young brain doesn't always know that.
For sure.
Yeah, because it is something that there's that cusp, right? As we're becoming the women that I think we can be so vulnerable.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I think when I think about when you think about people that you admire or that you see and you think, "Wow, they look great." You can have 2 people wearing the same outfit, maybe the same makeup and everything, but the difference is just this confidence they have. And I think we've all seen that where we'll wear something that we don't feel that confident in, and someone else can wear it and they're owning it, and it's a totally different look.
You're absolutely right, and thank you for bringing your daughter in. This side, I'm working on a book, kind of about that sort of
Oh,
like a
nice.
beauty faith book for. I think it's gonna be for preteens.
That'd be great.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
that kind of that bridging that area right there and seeing beauty and makeup and skincare through a God's lens.
Yeah.
So now we're going to go on to your book, Divine Detour, The Path You'd Never Choose Can Lead You to the Faith You've Always Wanted. And so your writing journey, your life journey is all just extraordinary. And I said earlier, is just the way you wrote it too. It's very honest. It's very raw. You don't hold back when you were asking questions about why is this happening. But at the same time, it's very, very foundational. It gives us hope and gives us scripture and gives us your own personal stories to hold on to see how God had a plan for you and to bring you through it all. And so let's talk about your story and I guess if you want to maybe so powerful when you were like when it just really first happened like that day if you want to talk about that.
Mm. Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for those kind comments about the book. That means a lot from you. But this whole started, and I wrote the book based on this, but it's not primarily about the medical events, but it's the background of the book. So I'll share with you that. And it started about almost 10 years ago. I had a medical evaluation for a life insurance policy, and that was to determine if I would qualify for preferred life insurance. And I did. And they told me at that evaluation that I had less than 3% chance of ever developing heart disease in my lifetime. When they told me that, I wasn't very surprised at that because I've always had low blood pressure and low cholesterol, and I've always really been a very healthy person. But then 3 weeks after that evaluation, I wasn't feeling well. And it was Thanksgiving week, and I knew I had a lot of stuff to do because I had kids at home and I had kids coming home from college. But I just had no energy, and I just was wiped out, which was so strange for me. And I went to convenient care a couple of times, and they gave me an inhaler and an antibiotic. And then Thanksgiving Day came, and I could hear everything going on in the house with the laughter and the dishes and my kids at home, and I just couldn't get out of bed. I just didn't have what it took to be upright and get out of bed. And the next day was Friday, and my husband got up and called our PCP and insisted that I be seen that day. And when I got into his office, he listened to my heart with a stethoscope, and he said, "If we're lucky, it's pneumonia." And he then sent me down to the x-ray lab to get a chest x-ray, and instead of pneumonia, what he found was an extremely enlarged heart, and it was functioning at just 6% when I went in that day, and he direct admitted me into cardiac ICU, and I saw in my chart that day for the first time a diagnosis of end-stage heart failure. And I spent 14 days in ICU, which was such a shock because I had no risk factors for heart disease of any kind, and I had no family history. And that was just a time of really starting to understand what was happening to me, but also I started to understand that the doctors really didn't expect me to leave the hospital because my heart was in such bad shape. I obviously did leave the hospital, but I was flown to Cleveland Clinic and became my doctor's most critical patient there for a year and a half. And recently she told me that my heart was the largest heart she'd ever seen. And they sent me home in a life vest external defibrillator and on lots of high-powered medications. And I also, in the things I brought home was a hospice binder because they gave me, the optimistic doctors were saying 5 years, but the more realistic ones were saying you better plan on 6 months. And we just elicited all the spiritual help we could find, and I had prayer chains going and so much support, and yet for 16 months, I had no improvement at all. I was barely hanging on, which is a small miracle in itself, but I had no improvement. And then there was a time at the 16-month mark where they tested my heart, and it showed that it was functioning at near normal for a bit. And we thought that the story was over at that point, that I'd been healed and that the prayers had been answered. And we were rejoicing and telling everyone. And then a couple years ago, my heart function dropped and I was in active heart failure again. And so this journey with heart failure, it's a chronic progressive disease. But what happened with my health was one story, but really the biggest story was what was happening with my faith during that time.
Let's talk about that.
Yes. So that was a hard time because I had my mother raised me in a home where I knew that she had a deep faith and we were raised to be believers, and then I married a believer and we raised our children in the church, and so it was just in the fiber of who I was. And yet I came to this point in my life where I couldn't reconcile what was happening in my life with the God that I had known all my life. And I reached this point where I had to decide whether I was going to dive in and ask those hard questions or whether I was going to try to protect my faith from those questions and kind of bubble wrap it and put it away.
That is really, really, really interesting. And so from reading your book, I know you asked those hard questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did. And I think what happened was at first I thought, I don't want to break this faith that I've been handed down so carefully, so I'm going to protect it. But there was a time within those first 16 months where I said, no, I have too much history with God. I've got to have that. I've got to ask him those questions. And during that time, that was really my tether to God and my faith, was the questions, because I would get up every day and all those questions would still be there. And I would say, I'm not letting go of you. We have this relationship and I'm going to ask you those questions. And by wrestling with those questions, and they were top of mind every day, and he was top of mind every day. So I didn't walk away from him. I engaged with him instead.
I wonder, in a sense, one, probably is that lifeline while you're here today too, but two, also for like when I read your book or all the people who read your book. And, I have another friend who has a chronic illness, and she reached a period where, yeah, she was well for a while. And then then wasn't for a bit, but then was, and that's sort of this, and in a sense, even if we don't have a chronic illness, I think as a believer, we go through that. And if we don't ask those hard questions, are we tethered to God as close as we could be?
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't have a chronic illness per se, although It could be. I have serial hearing loss in my right ear. It happened, I think, a year before the pandemic, and I was just out at a restaurant, and all of a sudden, glasses were clinking and everything, and then it was like, something's different. I can't hear out of this ear, and I thought it was, we had driven up a little bit north, so I thought maybe it was, so I took a Benadryl. I'm like, no. And I had read an article recently about, it was a singer who that happened to, and it's a virus, and there's a 72-hour window that you're supposed to get steroid shots and at that point. And so by that Monday, we have to go to urgent care, and I went there, and they couldn't get me into an ET, the hearing doctor, an ENT. But by the grace of God, she thought I had wax on my ear. And so she tried to scrape it out, poked to my ear, and it started bleeding.
Oh,
But that
no.
got me in to see the doctor.
Oh,
That's how it out, actually. And so he did this, we have. And so, and then just one thing led to the other, but I joined immediately on Facebook groups about this, and it's sort of a thing that nobody knows what really causes it. Everybody has their different theories, and I found a really good doctor. I got the treatment I needed, but my last visit with him, and I got the oldest doctor in our area who had worked with vets, because I thought if anybody can handle hearing, it's him. And the last time I saw him, my hearing's, it's stabilized. So I'm stable right now, which is great. And I have hearing aids. And although I'm eligible for a cochlear implant in this one, I don't need to go in that direction right now. But so kind of after the last meeting with him, he kind of had this kind of look on his face. And he's like, okay, kind of signing me out. And I go, so everything's just normal? Trying to get some kind of...
yeah.
And he goes, looks at me and goes, there's nothing normal about this. I have no idea why this happened. There's nothing normal. And I just like to walk away with that. Like, there's nothing normal.
Yeah.
And so I guess what that means is to keep an eye on it, because one day it could just go, and in the meantime, appreciate the birds singing outside, or the dog barking down the street, or and then little things will happen, like the fire alarm will go off, and my husband will say, the fire alarm's going off, and I will be like, I can hear the cricket outside, like,
yeah,
because it's just, so in a sense, it's a different kind of thing, but perhaps that's maybe in a sense why your story spoke to me too. It's just, your honesty about how to grapple with these kinds of things.
Yes, and I love the irony of the fact that you took a hearing loss, and then now you're doing this wonderful podcast that's helping everyone.
It's changed the way I listen.
Sure.
And that's also with God too. It's changed the way I listen to him, because when it first happened, he was immediately there for me.
Sure.
So right now we are talking about chronic illness, and we've been talking about that. And that is a thread throughout your book. And is there anything else that you want to share on that to the person who's at the beginning?
Yes, I think that's very wise what you're saying, because when you first get that chronic illness diagnosis, it feels like a forever diagnosis. And in a way it is, but I think the benefits of having that is that one of the things I had to learn, and I didn't learn it until I got my diagnosis, was that this side of eternity, some things don't fix. And I think I had always expected that if there was an illness, most of them were treatable and it could be fixed. And then, of course, I knew about terminal illnesses as well, but this idea of a chronic illness that you just have, it becomes part of who you are and part of what you carry with you every day. I was protected from that. And one of the things I think we do with our faith, or I know I did, is I was trying so hard to just get rid of that chronic illness, not knowing that what I really needed was just to find a way to carry it. And it occurred to me one day that faith was not designed to stop our bodies from being human. And sometimes we expect it to. Sometimes we expect to be superhuman because of our faith. But, even Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble. Not you might have trouble, but you will. And that's so that we'll long for a better world. And so that's all part of it. And everybody, whether you have a medical diagnosis or not, you have a forever diagnosis. We all know how this ends. And mine's just been verbalized to me and written down. And so in a way, that's been a gift because I've been able, just like you've been able to hear better, I've been able to see my life in a different way as well.
That's so beautiful. And then what you said about carrying it, and then that reminds me of the Bible verse, like, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden.
Right.
Let me help you carry it.
Yes.
Can't do it on our own, right?
No.
No. And then so what part of your mission and part of your story is that you want to share heart failure warning signs that you missed, and so that others will have a better outcome?
Yes. Yes, that's one of the things. It always felt to me like heart failure snuck up on me. And in a way, it kind of did. But I look back now and I know that I had symptoms that I just didn't recognize as heart related for maybe a decade before I was diagnosed. And I didn't realize it until I was actually trained at Mayo Clinic to be a community educator for Women Heart, to help women recognize those symptoms. And one of the things I learned there is that heart disease claims more lives worldwide, women and men, than all forms of cancer combined, which is hard to believe. And also that the only self-exam for heart disease is awareness. So it becomes so important for us to be aware of changes that are happening that we don't recognize in ourselves. And some of the ones that I didn't recognize as heart-related was I had an inability to exercise. And I just thought I was out of shape. And my husband runs marathons and my kids were in sports. And so I knew that I was the one that needed to get in shape. And that's what I just passed it off as. And I think we do that a lot as women at some point in our lives. So we're like, yeah, I've let myself go. I know I need to get back on it. And another very important one that my family all noticed and called out to me was that I had difficulties with any kind of inclines, whether that was a staircase or a hill, any kind of incline at all. I was out of breath to the point where they would leave me and have to come back for me because it was so difficult. I had that shortness of breath several times throughout the day. And I'd have a rapid heart rate that would come out of nowhere. And I didn't know what that meant. I had an unusual amount of fatigue, especially right there before my diagnosis. And they don't think it's genetic, but I was sharing these with my children just so they would be aware in case they did see any heart failure warning signs in themselves. And I said, now there's another one that I had, that I didn't have, but is actually a heart failure symptom, and that's a constant dry cough. And my youngest daughter, she said, Mom, you've always had a constant dry cough. When we would lose you in a store, that's how we would find you. We would just wait for you to cough. And I had no idea.
Right. Wow. Wow. Now, and then, so just because I would think, like, sometimes some of these symptoms might sound like something else. Like somebody might go, oh, you're just having a panic attack.
Yeah.
Or are you having an allergy? Probably why they gave you the persistent cough or dry cough. Or are you a smoker? Those kind of things. But things like not the, and then exercising too could have been just, oh, she's, like just doesn't want to, like kind of,
right.
Because there's that thing like I mean, exercising is so good for us and so wonderful, but there is, for some of us, I mean, I fall into this where I have to just put it on my schedule and say, you're going to do it. You're going to do it. You don't have a, you release and go for a walk. You have to, because you enjoy it. You just, I don't know where this thing in you is like, oh, I don't want to do that.
Right, right.
So
it's so easy to not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But when it reaches that point where you're really not doing it because you can't,
Right. Right.
and that's hard to, I think that line's probably hard for us to see when we don't want to see it, maybe.
Exactly.
Were you
And
scared, maybe? Were you?
I think so, because my husband would say, "This something's not right with you. We need to get it checked out." And I'd be like, you run marathons. You're in super condition. You don't know what it's like to just be a regular person." But I should have known. I signed up for a Couch to 5K with my oldest daughter maybe 4 or 5 months before my diagnosis. And if anybody's done a Couch to 5K, you know that it starts out really easy. The first day they say, stand up and walk 10 steps. Not really, but almost that easy. And I started out, and we were going to do it together. She lived in another state, but we were going to do it at the same time across the different states. And I remember going out there and trying to go between my mailbox and my next door neighbor's mailbox, and I couldn't do it. And I thought, this is so embarrassing. And I have to tell my daughter that I can't do it. And I just thought I had let myself go.
Oh,
And I thought, this is just embarrassing. And I never told my doctor, but if I had made a note, if you have access to your doctor online now, it's easy to do. And if I had just made a note about that, he might have put together some of the symptoms quicker than I would. So it's really important to share those and kind of be aware of the fact that maybe this is nothing, but maybe it's part of something bigger that I'm not seeing.
true, very, very true. And then so if somebody has some of these symptoms, what could they do? What should they do?
I think the main idea is to just make sure that it's on the radar of someone who's taking care of your medical. So if you have a primary care physician who takes care of you in an overall kind of way, keep a list of those and make sure, and which is hard to do because those doctor visits are so fast that you just want to hit the main things and not waste their
And
time.
they change sometimes.
Yes, yes. So make sure that you're making note of it in an email or some sort of message to your doctor so that that is on your record. And I think that's one of the things that I wish, looking back, that I had done, was just be more. We can feel like we have this burden of understanding what the heart failure warning signs are and cancer and diabetes, and it gets overwhelming. And that's not really our job. Our job is to just make sure that we're sharing things that are different or unusual or new about us to our doctor. And it's the doctor's job to figure out if those things create a problem for you.
That's really, really good advice. In your book, let's take one of your favorite essays or particularly meaningful essays in the book and talk about it. And then also, if you want to bring in a little bit of how the writing style unfolded, because the way you laid it out and wrote it is very unique, I think. I've read a lot of nonfiction books, and I found it really, it's almost like each essay's multifaceted.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it was one of those things that I didn't plan at all. I started out with a journal in the hospital. My friend dropped off this little spiral notebook, and I think she planned on me to write down doctor's instructions or instructions for the kids at home or something like that, phone numbers. And what it became was, in the middle of the night when they would come in and take my vitals, wake me up, I would have all these questions on my mind. Those questions for God would come up. And so I started writing them down in that little notebook. And I thought, someday I'm just going to burn this little notebook, but I have to get it out right now. So I would get up and I would write all this out. And it was angsty and very pointed. And just unlike how I would actually be in real life, but I was just being as completely honest as I could. And that became the jumping off point of so many things that I wrote about, because I didn't really start writing about it until almost a year later. And I had memories of those first days of my diagnosis, but I didn't have I couldn't remember the actual emotion and my actual feelings until I went back to my journal. And then I'm like, "Oh, I'm so glad I wrote that down, because now I remember exactly what it was like to be in that trenches right at that moment." And so the essays became these short pieces that I wrote, maybe about 10 minutes to read each one, and my mindset at that time was one of almost trauma, because I was dealing with this diagnosis and everything that was new in my life and the prognosis and all of that, and my attention span was about 10 minutes. And so I was writing in little chunks, but what I didn't realize is that the eventual reader would also have a shortened attention span, because they would be hurting, and they needed it to be in those short pieces. And so as those came out of me, I had no idea how they would ever become a book, but then those questions began to migrate into the 3 main life questions, and that's how the book came together. So I was so excited when that realization hit me, that those little pieces that I'd been writing could actually come together and form a book.
And then I'll be back here. The
No.
3 questions.
Yes, the 3 questions that I wrote about, and that all of the essays are, there's 13 in each essay, in each one of these questions. And the first one is what I call a question of doubt, and that is this life all there is? And then the second question is a question of, is God always good? And that's a question of worry. And then the third one is a question of control, and that's, is God's plan enough?
So good.
Yeah. And I think that the spoiler is that I don't necessarily hit the answer head on those questions, but I try to give the reader permission to ask the question in their own life with God and wrestle with that question.
Mm-hmm. And so on that, what would be the most important thing that the reader will learn about their faith from Divine Detours?
Well, my hope is that the reader would understand the value of questions in building faith. And I say that because most of my life I thought the value was in an answer. And the questions were sort of a point of weakness until you could get to the answer, and that was where the real value was. But what I've learned is that those questions are kind of like a grain of sand in your shoe, where you can't totally ignore it until you address the question. And so that is what built my faith and kept me connected to God when I could have just easily walked away. And so my hope is that the reader can find that asking those questions is what's going to draw them closer to God, because I think sometimes it feels like it's being disrespectful or pulling away from Him.
Well, I like how you said earlier that it tethered you to Him. And yeah, it's all so beautiful and very powerful. In the book, you say doubt is not the opposite of faith. Indifference is.
Yeah, I think when you think about, I think most of us think about doubt as being turning away from our faith. Like, we have faith and then we have doubt. But really, doubt is necessary to have faith. You have to make that choice. And to make that choice, you have to weigh the doubt that you have against the faith that you have. And so, one of my favorite writers talks about that grain of sand in your shoe, and he calls it, that he says doubt is the ants in the pants of faith. That's what keeps it alive and active, because you're turning toward it and you're engaging with it. It's almost like you're wrestling with it, and you're making it your own when you do that. And that's what I discovered is if you think about what would be the opposite of faith, the opposite of faith was just be walking away and saying, I don't care anymore.
Mm,
It's not worth my time to even investigate anymore.
mm.
But as long as you're in there and contending and looking and searching, you're still in the game and you're still narrowing and solidifying your faith and making it personal to your situation.
I think too, when you're doing that, you're being spiritually, I don't know the word fed, but in a sense, like you're being nurtured because you're being held in God's hand. I think there's a tendency, especially depending on how we've been raised religiously, if we may think that if we doubt that we don't believe.
Right, right. That's a big, and I don't know if it's part of our society or our upbringing, or maybe it's a personal tendency, but I had to fight that because I wasn't very good, even as a mom, when my kids would have questions that I didn't already have the answer to. I was uncomfortable with those questions that just sort of laid out there. And so I wish that I could go back and encourage those more, because that
Mm,
is what encourages them to dig in deeper into whatever it was.
mm. And so, how are how is your health and your faith doing now?
Yes. Well, now my heart is sort of on one of the lower dips in this journey. It's at 20%. And something new that happened 2 months ago, I had a stroke. And so that was a new chapter in all of this health journey that I've been on as well. But one of the great things is that I've been able to see that God's still in charge of my storyline, every bit of it, and he still has a plan as I'm starting to come out of all the effects of that. And so that's been reassuring to me to see that no matter what unexpected things come up, he's still there and he's still controlling the outcome.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I'm so glad you're here. I mean, this is like, and so in a sense though, that each time your faith gets even stronger.
It really does, because we have to we make that choice, that faith choice, more than just once in our lives. And the more times that we have to weigh it and choose it, the stronger that choice becomes, I think. And every time we hit a detour or a bump or a crisis in our lives, we, on some level, make that choice again. And that's an opportunity for your faith to get stronger each time that you do that.
Mm-hmm. And so you're recovering, your faith is getting stronger, and then I know your book is getting awards and all of those things. So what what are you writing more? Are you speaking, or what's
Yeah.
tell us a little bit in that area.
Yeah. So recently, the book came out, and then about a year later, it came out in audio, which I narrated, and that was a big step for the book. And then right now, as we're speaking, it's being translated into Spanish, so it will come out in its Spanish version in the next few months. And I've just been continuing to write, and speak has been a big part of this last year. I've been speaking, but I'm also working on a bit of a new book, and so that we'll see where God takes that idea, and just trying to be open to the path that it might have for that.
Is it a continuation of this, or is it sort of another insight that he has given you through all of this?
Yes, it'll be another book of essays, and so how that takes shape is still unknown, but I feel very strongly that he's saying to continue that format and that the essay idea, because I've had so many people reach out and say that that's what they needed to hear.
So on that, are you journaling too?
Yes, I do think I wish I was doing it more, but I do try to write in my journal as often as I can. But they tell you when you're writing a book to write from your scars and not from your wounds. And so I was careful to not write for a year or more after all of this happened initially. But I also wanted that wound to be known in there so that other people who were wounded at the time they're reading it could go, oh, that's how I'm feeling.
Oh, I see. So you had okay, I get it. So the journaling part's the fresh wound. The
Right.
essay around it is the scar.
Yes.
Wow, that's really powerful. And I liked what you said earlier about how you were writing in 10-minute intervals because that's all you could do for the person in the future who was where you were at, where that's all they can do. And
Right.
that's what the only way to communicate to them properly.
Right.
So you were writing for your reader, the reader one day, because like you had said earlier, and I think you were also talking about somebody else who said that this side of heaven, we're going to all go through something, right? Because what would you call it? Your forever
Oh,
diagnosis?
forever diagnosis. Yeah. 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 Most of us don't. I didn't know I had one before I had heart failure, but I had one before too.
Yeah, yeah. So that's so good. Well, I'm so excited for your upcoming book and everything that's going on with you. And I will definitely keep an eye out all for that. And would you first tell us where our listeners can find you?
Of course. So my website is loriannwood.com. And I want to mention that if anyone would like, there's a resource there about those heart failure warning signs that I missed. If someone's concerned about themselves or someone that they love, they can get that on my website at loriannwood.com/heart. And I would love to share that with anybody. And I'm also Lori Ann Wood on Instagram and Facebook, and they can reach out to me there.
That is wonderful. And would you like to say a prayer for our listeners?
Of course. Yes. If you'll pray with me. God, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to speak with Deborah today and to all of her listeners. We are reminded today, God, as we visit and talk about what you've done in our lives, that you are a God of healing, sometimes here on earth, but always in heaven. And that you're also a God that's not afraid of questions. You're a God who instead longs to keep the conversation going, and when that involves questions, you long to hear from us. And that you're a God who has good plans, even when the story isn't being played out the way we want it to in our lifetime. You're a God who is faithful to us, faithful to put people in our lives who can support us and help us and who we can influence. And we just thank you for showing us that anew today. Thank you so much for Deborah's ministry and what she's doing for so many listeners. And thank you for letting me be here today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure having you here.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. It's great to be here.
Thank you for listening to Beholder Beauty. We would love you to follow, subscribe, like, and comment. Also, be sure to pick up Lori Ann Wood's book, Divine Detour, and Unexpected Blessings on Amazon today. All right, thank you, and God bless you for being here.